Hello and welcome back. My name is Logan from West Desert Wheeler, and today we're going to be covering how to install my Axial Capra chassis mounted servo and Panhard kit. The main idea behind this is that oftentimes people purchase Axial Capras and they only want to purchase these cars to remove the axles off them. My part allows you to install a 3-link style axle setup commonly found on the SCX10-3 standard axle conversion kit, which is available separately. That's key. Axial Capra's axles at the point of making this video are not available separately, so you can take the axles off this car, use them on a different project, purchase these axles separately, and make your car work again. So that's what we're going to do today, is we're going to cover the install process on this setup. Now, some of the basic tools we're going to need a 7mm socket to remove your tires and wheels. I'm also going to need a 2mm driver, a 1.5mm driver, and also going to use some needle nose pliers on the install of my part. I'm going to completely tear this car down from its stock form and install a straight axle kit along with my kit using no extra parts, and we're going to cover every step along the way so that if you have any questions, all the answers will be in this video.
Let's go ahead and start by removing the center caps off of the wheels and grabbing our 7mm nut driver and removing all 4 wheels and tires off the corners of the car. Next, we're going to start with the rear axle swap, going from portal to straight axle, removing the lower link mount and the upper link out of the 4-link rear axle, and go ahead and pull that out of the car. The shock is included with that lower link mount, so those pop right out as well. Then we're going to be left with the drive shaft on the pinion of the axle. Go ahead and grab that set screw and remove it out of the car completely, as it is a through pin, and then remove the center section of the drive shaft. Grab this longer screw out of the straight axle conversion kit, as it will be necessary to use on the upper link mount of the AR45 straight axle. That is included with the straight axle kit and not my kit, but the hardware is in that kit. Go ahead and tighten up both upper rear links. Then we're going to grab the long lower screws for the shock mounts out of the Capra axles, and we're actually going to run the screw through the shock and the link on the lower AR45 axle. I prefer to run that setup. You can run your shock on the higher tab with the short hardware, but I prefer to run these shocks mounted at the same height as the lower links on this axle. This is going to give us a lower ride height and a better center of gravity while out rock crawling. Going to go ahead and do that for both the right and left side hardware through the shock body and then through the shock link as well. Grab our drive shaft and reinstall that center section into the output of the transmission, set screw through the pinion of the axle, tighten that up, and it's all set. Here's a quick suspension check on the rear, everything looking good and functioning correctly. Now we're going to remove the front axle, which is a very similar process. Remove the upper and lower links, which includes the shocks there on right and left side. Front axle should pop out. Then we're going to remove the drive shaft from the pinion of the axle, but we're still going to be held on by the servo. So let's go ahead and remove all 4 servo screws, and then let's remove the drag link from the axle on the Axial Capra. We can leave the drag link installed with that servo horn and leave the servo, the horn, and the drag link set together. Grab a 1.5mm driver and remove the 2 screws out of the grille of the car. This is the only time we're going to need a 1.5mm driver in this setup. Pop the grille out of the front nose of the chassis and slide it back through the nose of the chassis. That way it hangs free and out of the way. Now we're going to grab our 2mm driver again and remove the 2 screws out of the corner of the nose of the car. There's one on the left and one on the right that secure this plastic piece to the chassis of this cage. At this point, I remove the hood. I suggest that you do the same. It just gives you better access for installing this part, as you may need it here in a minute. And then we're going to remove the screws through the cross brace in the nose of the car, which is also attached to that plastic nose piece that we are going to remove from the chassis. Right and left sides. Squeeze the chassis apart and this will pop out. Go ahead and set it aside, as we will need it later when we reinstall it into the car. Now we've got the car fully stripped down. A quick look at all the progress we've made. Go ahead and remove our skid plate, removing all 4 skid plate screws. We are not removing the links from the lower skid, we are just removing the skid plate from the chassis, and then we're going to remove the driver's side upper link on the front of the car. If you have any questions on which link to remove, you can grab your front axle and take a look at where the upper link will mount to it and remove the opposite side. We're going to reinstall our skid plate back to the chassis And then we're going to grab our West Desert Wheeler Axial Capra chassis mounted servo bracket, making sure that we have all the parts that are included in the kit. We've got 2 backing plates, we've got 3 longer screws, 1 short screw, 6 M3 nuts, as well as 2 rod ends, which aren't in that shot, but they will appear magically later. And then we're going to slip our bracket Panhard side first into the chassis, and then drop the other side right into the car. Sometimes that can be a little finicky, but you'll get a feel for it after you do it a couple times. Installing our servo into the bracket is what we're working on next. I like to grab a servo screw through the servo, through the main bracket, and then slide the backing plate over the hardware to get everything installed. You can also grab a 2mm driver and apply pressure to that servo screw, so that way it holds everything in place while you grab your M3 nut. Probably go ahead and grab some needle nose pliers for this, as it is a little tricky to reach in there. You can also use the pad of your finger, and I will show you how I do that method. So you can slide the screw through all 3 and then push that screw back out flush. Push the M3 nut against the backing plate and slide it over where your screw comes through and try and get them connected that way. There's a few different processes for this. Of course, you can use needle nose pliers and a 2mm driver as well. Installing the upper screw on our servo there. I do recommend that you start with the upper servo mount screws and then move on to the lowers, as if you install the lowers, it gives you less room to work on the uppers if the lowers are already installed. As you install all these, make sure to make them snug. You can also use a driver to line up all 3 holes so that when you insert your hardware in here, it's easier to push through. Lower servo screw through all 3 pieces, and with this one you can use the pad of your finger as it's pretty easily accessible. Then tightening the lower screw and working the bracket down into the chassis of the car. Let's go ahead and remove our shocks at this point, as we will need to relocate them anyway. And then we're going to use one of my included screws in my kit, going through the rear shock mounting position all the way through the bracket. You can add an M3 nut if you choose, but they are not necessary, as this screw is going through plastic and it will not be able to back out. Installing it in both the right and left sides. This screw should protrude all the way through my bracket and will come through by a few millimeters. Again, you can use an M3 screw. I don't include one as it's not completely necessary, but if you want to clean up the look, you're welcome to do that. Now we've got our WDW bracket fully installed into the car. Taking a quick look at how everything should be situated and how everything should look. Now let's go ahead and grab our straight axle, and we're going to remove the drag link, since we've already got the drag link we want installed on the servo. 1 screw out of there, grab the servo and grab the drag link from the servo and throw your hardware through the drag link and then down into our new AR45 straight axle. Making sure that the rod end for the steering arm is in its correct place. Now we're going to install the upper link of the suspension, install the shock in the forward shock mounting hole. But before we get going too fast, we're going to swap rod ends on our lower front links, which is why I have included these. These are available in my kit. They are the equivalent to a Traxxas 5525, but I am using the RPM part. So insert something through the link of the Capra links, and make sure that the rod end that you're trying to remove, the machined ring is the right-handed thread. The opposite side is a left-handed thread. So if you're having a difficult time getting your rod ends off, it might be because it's left-hand threads. Then I'm going to use a pair of these pliers to pop the pivot ball out of the rod ends. We're going to reuse these pivot balls on these new rod ends. Insert that onto the new rod end, clamp it with your pliers, and apply some upward pressure, and it should snap right into place. Go ahead and repeat the process for the rod end number 2. Now we're going to start to install these back onto the links. Make sure that it is the right-handed thread or left-handed thread, doesn't matter which way it goes on. Just make sure you know which direction you're trying to rotate it to get it to go on. Now we are ready to install the link and the new rod end into the lower front axle mount, grabbing the longer hardware to go through the shock and through the link mount and the new rod end. Grabbing our driver and securing everything into place. We're going to do that on the right and left side, removing the other shock, moving its position, installing the new rod end, and installing the hardware to hold everything together. At this point, find the 12mm screw included in the straight axle kit, as that 12mm screw is what is necessary to put the Panhard on the axle side. If the threads are too long, it will run into your shock and cause issues. This is the orientation where you want to run your Panhard, running the 12mm screw through the bracket on the axle side. Now we're going to take our Panhard bar and run one of my longer included screws with my kit through the Panhard arm on my bracket, through the lower hole, and through the Panhard arm, and then we're going to secure that with one of my included M3 nuts. Securing them together through the main bracket, through the backing plate, through the rod end, and tightening it all together. Grab a pair of needle nose pliers and a driver, and everything should be nice and secure there. Now we're going to throw the short included screw in my kit and one more M3 nut on the upper portion of that Panhard bar. Go ahead and tighten those up together as well. Now it's time to reinstall the plastic cross brace into the chassis. Pulling the chassis apart to get a little more clearance needed, and it should snap right into place. Grab the hardware that we removed from it earlier, and now that is going to go back into the chassis. When you reinstall your shocks, make sure that they are in the forward mount position, as it may cause clearance issues if they are not in the forward position. Pushing our grill back through the nose piece of the chassis, it should snap through with a little bit of work. Then we are going to reinstall the nose piece back into the other portion of the chassis. This can take a little bit of muscling it and maneuvering it into position, but it will snap back into position. At which point, grab your screws for the front corners of the nose of the chassis, install those back in there, grab your 1.5mm driver and reinstall your grill, and then do a suspension check. Make sure everything is looking as it should and everything can articulate and flex as it should. So to set our pinion angle, once we've got those longer rod ends in there, they actually go a little too far and our pinion angle may sit a little too low. So if you increase the length on the upper link, it will get your pinion angle set back where you need. Typically I've found that it's 2 full rotations to get that pinion angle where I want it. Let's reinstall our drive shaft, reinstall the pinion screw, and then we're going to put our hood back onto the car. If you tighten these screws too much, it can change the way the hood opens and closes, so if it's not easily opening and closing, you can loosen those screws a bit and it will go right back to the way it was. Let's reinstall our wheels, finding the 12mm hex, dropping the 7mm nut on there, and then adding our hubcap to all 4 corners. The only things we should have remaining is a pile of hardware from the straight axle kit, 2 factory rod ends, a drag link, an upper link, your Axial Capra axles, and you're going to have some shocks and a few other parts from the straight axle kit that are not necessary for what we've supplied here. Now we're taking a look at the completed car and doing a quick suspension check with our 3-link geometry up front. One thing I focused on was really trying to eliminate bump steer with this setup, and I feel that I've done a pretty good job at doing that while still retaining large amounts of steering throw with this 3-link setup in this car. A few other things I want to mention is that I strongly suggest going to a flat skid and converting to a 3-gear transmission. The Axial Capra transmission does not have enough gearing reduction for a simple straight axle swap. It will make your car noticeably faster, and it is also harder on components to try and rock crawl with them. So going to something like a UC Fab skid, which has a direct 3-gear bolt, or even something like a Vader skid that has an adapter plate available, the link geometry on those skid plates drops right in. It doesn't affect your link lengths or anything like that. I strongly suggest going that route. It will add more gearing reduction and you will have a better time out on the trail while trying to rock crawl. Now obviously if you're trying to go fast, then just leaving the stock Axial Capra transmission in there is a good choice for you. Here is one of my cars actually out at a North vs. South Utah RC Crawling Championship run, and running this in the Unlimited course. Having a great time out there. This car does have a 3-gear transmission and a fusion in here. It worked out really great. I've really enjoyed my time with this car. It has really strongly surprised me with the capability of what it can actually do. It is much better than I thought this original product was going to be, and you can get a lot of performance out of these straight axle swapped Axial Capras. But my name is Logan with West Desert Wheeler. I hope this answered all of your questions. Again, I strongly suggest going to a 3-gear transmission. I greatly appreciate your support in purchasing one of my products. It's really helped me make all this possible. We will see you guys in the next one. Keep the rubber side down.